I should have known from the start. When I first met David, he was everything I thought I wanted in a man, successful, confident, charming in all the ways that mattered. I was young, maybe too young to understand what confidence really looked like in someone like him. At that time, I thought his firm opinions, his decisive nature, and the way he seemed to take control of every situation were signs of strength. I thought I needed someone like him, someone to anchor me to reality. But I was wrong. I mistook control for love. I mistook manipulation for care. Back then, everyone around me praised him. My parents were thrilled when I introduced him to them. My mother, always concerned about my future, immediately saw him as a catch. She said he'd take care of me, that he was the kind of man who'd keep me safe. I think she meant financially, though I always heard something more behind her words. A promise that he'd keep me from making the mistakes she thought I was destined to make. I didn't see it at the time. How could I? David was perfect in the beginning. He brought me flowers, took me to expensive restaurants, always complimented me in ways that made me feel like I was the most beautiful woman in the room. He said I was smart too, that he loved my ambition to write, and that I had so much potential. But now, as I sit here looking back on those early days, I realize all those compliments came with invisible chains. He was already laying the groundwork, setting the rules for what I could and couldn't be. I stopped writing a year into our relationship. I didn't even notice at first. I'd make excuses. I'm too busy, I'd tell myself. David's schedule is so demanding, I'll write later. But later never came. Instead, David slowly inserted himself into every part of my life. The things I used to love, my books, my writing, my friends fell away. And then, one by one, the people in my life began to disappear too. It started subtly. David didn't like Natalie, my best friend from college. She was too negative, he said. She's jealous of us, of what we have. At first I defended her, but David always had a way of twisting things around. He made me doubt her intentions, made me believe that maybe she wasn't as good a friend as I thought. Holding you back, he said one evening after I'd spent a rare afternoon catching up with her. You're too good for her. Can't you see she's just bitter because she doesn't have what we have? I didn't see it then, but that was his first step in isolating me. Over time, I started to believe him. I let go of Natalie, stopped calling her, stopped making plans. Eventually, she stopped calling too. One by one, my friends faded into the background, leaving me alone with David at the center of my world. And that was exactly what he wanted. I wasn't living, I was surviving. It took me a long time to admit that to myself. By the time I realized how trapped I was, it felt like it was too late. The house we lived in, it was beautiful, sprawling, with high ceilings and marble floors, looked like a dream to anyone who visited. But to me, it felt like a gilded cage. Every time I walked through its hallways, I could feel the weight of his control pressing down on me. The world saw a loving, successful marriage. I saw a prison. It wasn't always like this, I'd remind myself, as if that made the reality any easier to bear. There were days when David could be charming, when he'd surprise me with gifts, or take me on extravagant vacations. It was during those times that I could almost convince myself that everything was fine. But then he'd lose his temper. It was always over something small, something insignificant that I'd done wrong. At first, it was the words sharp, cutting words that tore through me. You're useless, he'd say, after I'd accidentally burned dinner. I should have married someone who actually knows how to be a wife. I told myself that all couples argued, that maybe I wasn't being the best wife I could be. He was stressed after all. The business was growing, and I thought I should be more understanding, more supportive. But deep down I knew that no amount of understanding would stop his temper from boiling over again. The first time he hit me, I was in shock. It wasn't a slap. It wasn't a punch. It was worse. It was like he had just been waiting for the right moment to explode, and I had finally given him the excuse he needed. I can't even remember what the argument was about anymore, just that he grabbed me by the wrist, his fingers digging into my skin, and threw me against the wall so hard that my vision blurred. But I just didn't. Instead, I apologized. I don't even know what for. Maybe for not being the woman he wanted me to be. Maybe for burning dinner. Maybe for breathing. David apologized the next day. He brought me flowers, said he'd lost his temper because of work stress. He said he loved me, that he was sorry, and that it wouldn't happen again. And for a while I believed him. I let myself believe it because the alternative was too painful to face. But of course, it did happen again, and again. Each time, the apologies became shorter, more routine, like he was checking off a box on a list. You know how much I love you, he'd say after each incident, but you need to stop pushing me. The worst part was, I started to believe that too. I stopped pushing. I stopped fighting back. I just existed. The day David told me about the affair was the day something inside me broke. It had been a long day. I remember that much. He had come home late, as usual, barely looking at me as he kicked off his shoes and loosened his tie. Had dinner waiting, but I already knew he wouldn't eat it. He never did when he was in one of his moods. He sat down across from me at the kitchen table, his eyes cold, distant. I remember thinking that he looked like a stranger. I didn't even recognize the man sitting in front of me anymore. Laura, he started, his voice flat, emotionless. There's something I need to tell you. I waited, my heart already sinking because I knew, instinctively, that whatever he was about to say would shatter me. Spectres, and it did. I've been seeing someone else, he said, just like that. No apology, no shame, just a simple statement of fact. I stared at him, uncomprehending, because even though I knew our marriage was a disaster, I hadn't expected this. I hadn't expected her. I've been seeing her for a few years now, he continued, like he was talking about the weather. And there's a child. A boy. His name is Oliver. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. I just sat there, numb, as the words washed over me, each one cutting deeper than the last. He had been cheating on me for years, and now he had a son with another woman. I want him to come live with us, David said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. His mother isn't in the picture anymore. It's our responsibility to raise him. Our responsibility. I wanted to laugh. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw something at him, to tear apart the kitchen, the house, every reminder of the life I had once thought we were building together. But I didn't do any of those things. Instead, I nodded, like the obedient wife I had been trained to be. Okay, I said, my voice hollow. Okay. Oliver arrived a week later. He was quiet, confused, and I could see the fear in his eyes as he clung to David's leg, unsure of his place in this new world. I didn't blame him. How could I? He was just a child, an innocent bystander in David's betrayal. I wish I could say I felt some immediate connection to him, some maternal instinct that kicked in the moment I laid eyes on him. A Daus winter. But that would be a lie. All I felt was numbness. Every time I looked at him, all I could see was David's infidelity. All I could feel was the weight of the life I no longer controlled. David, of course, expected me to raise Oliver as if he were my own. He didn't ask. He simply demanded, and I did what I had always done. I complied. I played the role of mother. But I wasn't his mother. I couldn't be. Then, just as I was beginning to adjust to this new reality, I found out I was pregnant. I didn't feel joy. Not at first. I felt panic. I was standing in the bathroom staring at that little stick, the two blue lines staring back at me like some kind of curse. My hand trembled as I set it down on the counter, my heart pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears. I wanted a baby, hadn't I? Once I had dreamed of this moment, of David and I starting a family. But not like this. Not when everything was already falling apart. I sat down on the cold tile floor, my back pressed against the wall as I tried to process what this meant. Another child. A baby. My baby. How would I raise this child in the chaos that had become my life? David barely looked at me anymore, barely acknowledged my existence unless he was angry. Balls. He had his son now, his perfect little heir from another woman. What place did my child have in his life? And worse than that, what kind of father would he be? I had seen what he was capable of. I knew the darkness that lived inside him, the way his temper could flare without warning. Could I really bring a child into this world, knowing what kind of man their father was? But the thought of leaving it terrified me. David had all the money, all the power. I had nothing. No job, no family to fall back on, no friends left to lean on. How would I survive? How would I take care of a baby on my own? I stayed there on the bathroom floor for what felt like hours, the pregnancy test still lying on the counter, taunting me with the reality I didn't know how to face. Eventually I stood up and walked out of the bathroom without a word. I didn't tell David that night. I couldn't. I didn't know how, but the next morning, as I was making breakfast, he walked into the kitchen and gave me that look, the one that always made me brace for what was coming. "You're acting strange," he said, his voice sharp, accusing. "What's going on with you?" I froze, my hand gripping the spatula so tightly my knuckles turned white. I couldn't lie to him. He would find out eventually. He always found out. "I'm pregnant," I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, there was silence. Then, slowly, David walked over to me, a strange look on his face. It wasn't happiness. It wasn't excitement. It was something else. "You're what?" he asked, his tone cold, calculating. "I'm pregnant," I repeated, this time a little louder. He didn't smile. He didn't hug me or congratulate me. Instead, he just stood there, staring at me like I had just told him something inconvenient, something that would ruin his carefully laid plans. "Well, isn't that something?" he said, his voice flat. "Another mouth to feed." I turned and walked out of the kitchen without another word. That's when I knew. I wasn't raising this baby for him. I was raising this baby for me. The months passed in a blur of nausea, exhaustion, and growing tension. David continued to play the role of the cold, distant husband, barely acknowledging my pregnancy, except for the occasional reminder that I'd better not expect him to change diapers. Oliver, too, was adjusting to life in our house, though he was quiet and withdrawn, still unsure of his place in this fractured family. He followed David around like a shadow, desperate for attention that never came. It broke my heart to see him like that, but there was only so much I could do. I was pregnant, exhausted, and trying to hold myself together while David's control continued to suffocate me. But everything came to a head one night, in my 7th month of pregnancy. David had been drinking, something he had started doing more and more often. It was late, and Oliver was already in bed, leaving the two of us alone in the living room. I was sitting on the couch, my swollen belly making it hard to get comfortable, while David stood near the window, a glass of whiskey in his hand. "I'm thinking of expanding the business," he said suddenly, breaking the silence. I didn't respond. I was too tired to care. "You should be happy," he continued, his words slurred slightly. "This expansion will mean more money, more security for all of us." I stared down at my hands, trying to block him out. "Are you even listening to me?" he snapped, turning toward me, his face twisted with anger. "Yes," I said quietly, though I hadn't really been paying attention. "Then act like it," he growled, stepping closer to me. I looked up at him, and for the first time, I didn't see the man I had married. I saw a monster. A man who had taken everything from me. My freedom, my dreams, my dignity. And who still expected more. "I don't care about the business, David," I said, my voice trembling but firm. "I don't care about money or security or anything you're offering. I just want to be free." His face darkened, and before I could react, he grabbed me by the arm, pulling me up from the couch. His grip was so tight it felt like my bones were being crushed. "Free?" he spat. "You think you're going to be free? You think you can just walk away from this?" My heart raced as I tried to pull away from him, but he wouldn't let go. "You're mine, Laura," he snarled. "You'll always be mine. Don't you ever forget that." For a moment, fear paralyzed me, but then something shifted inside me. Something stronger than the fear, stronger than the years of control he had over me. I looked him in the eye, my voice shaking but full of resolve. "No, David, I'm not yours. Not anymore." He stared at me, stunned, as if he couldn't believe what I had just said. Then, with a violent shove, he let go of me, sending me stumbling back onto the couch. "You ungrateful bitch," he muttered, as he stormed out of the room, leaving me trembling, clutching my belly, and gasping for air. I sat there for a long time after he left, my body shaking with adrenaline, but for the first time, I wasn't just afraid. I was angry at him for what he had done to me, angry at myself for letting him. That was the moment I decided I wasn't going to live like this anymore. After that night, everything changed. I knew I had to leave. Not just for me, but for my baby, for the life growing inside me, for the future I wanted to build that didn't include David's cruelty, his violence, his suffocating control. But I also knew that escaping him wouldn't be easy. He held all the cards, the house, the money, the business, everything was in his name. But I had something he didn't. I had time. And I had my will. For the next few months, I started making plans. Quietly, secretly. I saved what little money I could from the grocery allowance David gave me, stashing it away in an old coat pocket in the back of my closet. I reached out to an old friend, someone David had driven away years ago, asking for her help in finding a lawyer, and I started documenting everything, every bruise, every cruel word, every outburst. I knew I couldn't confront him head-on. He was too powerful, too dangerous. But I could prepare. I could bide my time and wait for the moment when I could strike. And that moment came sooner than I expected. David's health had been declining for months, but I hadn't paid much attention to it. I was too focused on my escape plan, on making sure I had everything in place before I made my move. But then, one day, he collapsed in the middle of the living room. At first I thought it was just another drunken stumble, but when he didn't get up, I realized something was wrong. I called 911, and they rushed him to the hospital, where the doctors confirmed it. David was terminally ill. They said it was some kind of aggressive cancer, that he didn't have long left. I should have felt something. Grief maybe, or shock. But all I felt was cold, detached, like I was watching someone else's life unravel, not my own. David, of course, tried to use his illness to manipulate me. He cried, actual tears, for the first time in years, begging me to forgive him, to nurse him through his recovery. He promised to be better, to make up for all the things he had done. He even gave me control of his assets, the house, the business, everything, as if that would make up for the years of abuse. But I wasn't the same woman I used to be. I wasn't his obedient wife anymore. As his health deteriorated, I grew stronger, more determined. I knew his illness was my chance, my way out. And I took it. The day I told David the first was leaving him was the first day I truly felt free. His refrain. He had just returned from the hospital, weak and frail, expecting me to care for him. But instead, I met him at the door, suitcase in hand, my baby sleeping peacefully in the carrier strapped to my chest. "I'm not your nurse, David," I said, my voice steady, calm. "And I'm not your wife anymore." He stared at me, his eyes wide with disbelief. "What are you talking about?" "I'm leaving," I said simply. "I'm taking the baby, and Oliver, and I'm leaving. This is over." For a moment he looked like he might argue, like he might try to pull me back into his web. But then he saw the determination in my eyes, and he knew. He knew I was serious. "You can't leave," he whispered, his voice weak. "I need you." "No, David," I said. "You need control, but you don't have that anymore. I'm taking it back." I turned and walked out the door, not once looking back. It wasn't easy, starting over, but it was worth it. I moved into a small apartment on the other side of town, far away from the house that had been my prison for so many years. I found a job, started saving money, started rebuilding the life that David had tried to destroy. And most importantly, I raised my children in peace. Without fear. Without violence. I heard later that David died a few months after I left. I didn't go to the funeral. I didn't even send flowers. He was just a ghost in my past now, a reminder of what I had survived. Freedom came at a price, but it was a price I was willing to pay, because for the first time in years I was free.